The Vatican press chamber, draped in centuries of solemn history, had never felt so pierced by modern tension. The lights were not holy candles but surgical, white and cold, fixed on the figure seated alone at the center. Cameras blinked like mechanical eyes. Translators waited with hands poised. And the air itself trembled, heavy with unspoken expectations. Across from the papal throne, at a carefully measured distance, sat Jasper Renley. A journalist known not merely for questions, but for dismantlings. He had drawn confessions from kings, cracked facades of billionaires, and once made a cardinal weep on live television. Sharp, smooth, and smiling, Jasper didn't come to ask. He came to expose. And now, in the sacred heart of Catholic power, he drew his blade. "Your Holiness," he said, voice lacquered with polite aggression, "are you dismantling Pope Francis' legacy?" It was not just a question. It was an accusation dressed as inquiry. The kind that didn't wait for a reply, because it assumed guilt. One question, but behind it lay 1,000 fires: the reforms on inclusion, the outreach to the marginalized, the ecological mission, the softening tone of the Church. The chamber froze. One could almost hear the tightening of shoulders. Cardinals shifted uneasily. Assistants glanced at each other. The whole Vatican, it seemed, held its breath, suspended between tradition and revolution. Pope Leo XIV did not flinch. He looked at Jasper, not as a man cornered, but as a man rooted, an old oak in a field of flashbulbs. His eyes did not burn with offense, nor plead for approval. They carried something older. Deeper. A kind of clarity one earns not from power, but from loss. From prayer. From carrying other people's pain. And when he finally spoke, his voice was low, deliberate, and unexpectedly tender. "You speak of legacy," he said, as if it were a statue to protect from the wind. But a true legacy breathes. It burns. And sometimes, it must be purified. A silence fell, deeper than before. Not even the shutters clicked. The journalist, for the first time, blinked too long. A flicker of uncertainty passed across his face. The kind of moment too subtle for headlines, but unmistakable to the soul. A shift in the room. A weight transferred. It was no longer the Pope being questioned. It was the question itself, exposed in its shallowness. And outside the Vatican walls, in cathedrals and cafes, in living rooms and phone screens across the globe, millions leaned forward, not out of curiosity, but conviction. Something had just cracked. And something greater had just taken root. He had been born Matteo Bianchi, the son of a widowed seamstress in the narrow lanes of Bari, where salt from the Adriatic clung to stone walls and the voice of the church echoed louder than the cries of merchants. His first pulpit was a broken crate outside a dilapidated orphanage, where he preached barefoot to street children, fishermen, and anyone willing to pause between despair and routine. He spoke with no microphone, no vestment, no title, only hunger in his belly and scripture in his bones. They called him Il Prete di Fumo, the smoke priest, because he often emerged from alleyways shrouded in incense stolen from ruined chapels. But even then, his voice carried something that drew hearts. Not performance, not even persuasion, but presence. When Matteo spoke, even pigeons stopped pecking the pavement. He was ordained with reluctance, elevated with suspicion, and chosen with near-unanimous silence. A cardinal who had once dismissed him as a theological relic later whispered, "He carries something that cannot be trained." The conclave that birthed Pope Leo XIV was not marked by consensus, it was marked by surrender. His ascent followed a papacy that had shifted the soul of Catholicism outward. Pope Francis, the Jesuit reformer, had dared to breathe into taboos. He reached toward the LGBTQ+ community, empowered women in corners of church governance, championed environmental repentance, and embraced the pain of refugees. His vision was one of open arms, porous walls, and radical accompaniment. Some called it mercy. Others, delusion. And into this moment stepped Leo, a man carved by silence, not applause. He was not an answer to Francis. He was a question to everyone else. Where Francis welcomed dialogue, Leo returned to doctrine. Where Francis sought bridges, Leo demanded altars. Where Francis deferred to synodality, shared governance, Leo reinstated hierarchy, not as control, but as clarity. Not all agreed. Few understood. And none remained neutral. The contrast was not just philosophical. It was deeply human. Francis smiled like a grandfather. Leo stared like a confessor. And now, the collision was public. Scripted in part, but pulsing with undercurrents of real stakes. The Vatican had opened its gates to the world through an unprecedented live Q&A, a theological broadcast streamed in over 180 nations. Not a sermon. Not a statement. A confrontation. And across from him, Jasper Renley. Jasper, who had covered genocides and papal elections, who could coax a scandal from a sigh, who once reduced a French archbishop to stammering tears by quoting his own contradictory sermons. He had no allegiance but the lens. No sanctuary but the truth as he saw it. And yet, his presence here was not casual. He'd waited for this seat, this hour, this exact imbalance of light and shadow. Because he knew what many feared to say aloud, the soul of the church was no longer drifting. It was turning. And the man at the wheel wore white. The stakes were global. Catholics who had found solace in Francis' inclusive theology now trembled at Leo's austerity. Bishops whispered of schism. Activists warned of regression. The faithful, divided. Some prayed for return. Others prayed for resistance. But none could ignore it. The question had been asked. The legacy had been challenged. And beneath it all, something older than reform or tradition stirred. A war not of politics, but of posture. Not of left and right. But of kneeling, or not. Too many people criticize from comfort. If this moved you already, subscribe to Circle of God's Glory. If not, let us know why you won't, but don't hide. Let your silence answer for you. Jasper's lips barely moved, but his voice filled the space like a veil of incense, pleasant in tone, poisonous in purpose. Your Holiness, he began, many would say that the Church, under your leadership, is shifting backwards. The progress made under Pope Francis toward inclusion, climate justice, and modern relevance, is being quietly, and some say deliberately, unraveled. Why, he asked, tilting his head as if offering a gift, are you undoing progress? He delivered the word, progress, like a benediction, as though it were sacred, immutable, beyond questioning. But Leo did not blink. He did not lean back, nor lean forward. He remained still, like a stone at the center of a storm. Because progress, Leo said, is only holy when it moves us toward the cross. Not away from it. The words floated into the silence, elegant and edged like a psalm etched into marble. Jasper offered a practiced chuckle, just loud enough for the microphones to catch. But isn't that the kind of answer that's losing the church its future? Statistics show the youth are leaving. LGBTQ Catholics feel unwelcome. Women feel unheard. What do you say to those who feel your papacy is alienating the very people the church must now depend on to survive? The trap was skillfully laid, pit survival against sanctity, turn compassion into compromise, frame exclusion as the only possible product of conviction. Again, Leo's answer came not as reaction, but revelation. The young are not leaving because the church is too ancient, he said. They are leaving because we've made the sacred look optional, and the eternal negotiable. We must lead them to truth, not chase them into error. There was no thunder in his voice, but there was thunder in the pause that followed. Jasper's eyes narrowed, the gleam of certainty slightly dulled. He pivoted. But what if they won't come, Your Holiness? What if the world doesn't want the version of faith you offer? Leo breathed, one deliberate inhalation, like drawing spirit into flesh. Then we will love the world. But we will not imitate it. It was the kind of answer that did not entertain debate, because it was not designed to win. It was designed to endure. Leo was not a man building consensus. He was a man guarding a consecration. The room remained still. The cameras rolled. No one interrupted. Even Jasper, polished and prepared, paused too long before his next line. Because the deeper conflict had surfaced, not between two men, but between two visions of the church. One that bends to meet the world, and one that kneels to remind it. If that response made you pause, you owe it to yourself to subscribe to Circle of God's Glory. If you disagree, be bold enough to say why in the comments. Don't stay silent like the lukewarm. Scripture has already spoken to that fate. The air, once reverent and still, began to tighten, subtly, imperceptibly at first, like the quiet pressure before a storm. Jasper leaned forward. The smile that had once masked his agenda now twitched at the corner, less a sign of confidence and more of necessity. He had tested the Pope's theology. He had challenged his tone. But still, Leo did not crack. So Jasper did what every seasoned interrogator eventually must, he went for the wound. "Forgive me, Your Holiness," he said, voice now polished to a harder edge, "but isn't this all fear? Isn't this rigidity, this retreat into dogma, just a way to avoid facing what the world has become? Aren't you afraid of the future?" There it was. Not a question, but an indictment cloaked in civility. It struck at the heart not only of Leo's papacy, but of his person. Fear, cowardice, was the one thing a man of God must never be seen to possess. The room did not move. Even the translators paused, perhaps unsure whether to carry the question across languages or let it die in the silence it had birthed. But Leo, ever unmoved, lowered his gaze, not in submission, but in memory. "No," he said, and the word came like a stone into still water. "I am not afraid of the future. But I remember the past." And then he spoke, not as Pope, but as witness. He spoke of the orphanage where a boy was raped by the man who baptized him, and how the confessional became a cage instead of a cradle. He spoke of the parishioner in Argentina who left the church because her child's suicide was met with doctrine instead of comfort. He spoke of how, in trying to modernize faith, the church had sometimes amputated its soul for applause. He did not speak in anger. He spoke in ache. "We are not going backward," Leo said, voice clear now, almost luminous. "We are going deeper. Because the surface has cracked. And beneath it, the roots have rotted." A murmur moved through the room, not loud, not chaotic, but unmistakable. Some turned their eyes away. A bishop in the back pressed 2 fingers against his temple. A camera operator, unaware, swallowed audibly. Still, Leo continued. "When the church forgets that the gospel is not a brand, but a burden, when it becomes more interested in hashtags than holiness, we lose not only the world's respect, but heaven's favor." He turned his eyes toward Jasper, but it felt as though he was speaking to the watching nations. "You asked if I am afraid. No. I have heard the confessions of priests who broke their vows behind closed doors. I have held the hands of mothers who buried children they raised in the pews. I have walked through smoke where incense once rose. I am not afraid of the future. I am afraid of a church that forgets who she is." Silence again, but now it was different, charged, swollen with something electric and ancient. It was not quiet for the sake of etiquette. It was the stillness that comes when truth lands and begins to rearrange the furniture inside a person's soul. Leo stood taller, though he had not moved an inch. "The gospel unites," he said, "because it demands nothing less than everything. But politics divides. It makes us choose sides instead of sanctity." At those words, even Jasper faltered. Not visibly. Not publicly. But inwardly, a ripple of doubt flickered beneath his polished exterior. It was the look of a man who had drawn blood many times, and was now unsure whether he had pierced armor, or touched a nerve that he did not understand. You just saw courage clothed in humility. If you respect that, subscribe to Circle of God's Glory. And if you can't, if something in you resists, then explain why. But don't scroll away pretending neutrality is nobility. In times like these, silence is not grace. It's guilt in disguise. The silence had begun to betray Jasper. Not the kind of silence he was used to, the kind that precedes applause or concedes dominance, but the kind that shifts the ground beneath a man's certainty. His questions, once surgical, now sounded like echoes trying to catch up with something older and deeper than language. And Pope Leo, without raising his voice, had wrested the momentum away, not by force, but by refusing to flinch. So Jasper did what men cornered by truth often do, he dropped the pretense of curiosity and reached for accusation. So what are you saying, Your Holiness? He asked, the edges of restraint fraying. That Pope Francis was wrong? The words hit the room like a dropped chalice. For a brief second, something changed in Leo's eyes. Not fury. Not shame. But something far more dangerous to the age, clarity. His gaze, slow and unwavering, settled on Jasper with the weight of 1,000 prayers prayed in silence. I say, he began, that Pope Francis brought mercy into the storm. And I bring correction so that mercy is not mistaken for permission. No gasps yet, but hearts clenched. He reached slowly beneath his white cassock and withdrew a simple rosary, its beads worn smooth, its crucifix faintly chipped. It was not gold. It was not jeweled. It was made of olive wood and cord, the kind pilgrims carry in secret, the kind found in the pockets of the poor. This, he said, lifting it for the room to see, was given to me by a girl in Aleppo. 9 years old. Her parents died in the bombing. She had been trafficked. And yet, she prayed. Every day. Even after all she had seen. She gave this to me and said, don't let them take Jesus away from us too. He held the rosary higher, not for display, but for defense. You call it naive, he said quietly, to protect the innocent. I call it sacred. It was not just a statement. It was a fracture. A low gasp moved through the press chamber, followed by the subtle movement of hands to mouths, crossed arms loosening, eyes blinking too often. Not all believed. But all were stirred. And beyond the Vatican walls, screens lit up. The quote had already been clipped, translated, circulated. Hashtags began forming like cracks in a dam. Tweets were launched. News anchors were summoned. The phrase echoed in sanctuaries and secular spaces alike. Back in the room, Jasper faltered, not obviously, not entirely, but enough for those who knew the language of power to recognize a loss of ground. Leo did not press the advantage. He did not gloat. He merely returned the rosary to his chest and folded his hands as if in prayer. I do not seek to undo what was done in love, he said. I seek to root it in truth, so that love does not become indulgence, and compassion does not collapse into compromise. Jasper opened his mouth to reply. But nothing came. Not because he lacked words. But because the room, once his theater, no longer belonged to him. This is where the real line gets drawn. If you're still watching, subscribe to Circle of God's Glory. Or tell us why you won't, if you have the courage. Because this isn't performance. This is conviction. And every soul watching must now choose, protect the flame, or applaud the fog. The chamber, once filled with the restless pulse of ambition and media mechanics, had gone still again, but this time, not from suspense. This was the silence that follows recognition. Not agreement. Not conversion. Just the first, undeniable realization that something once familiar had become suddenly, unsettlingly unmovable. Jasper glanced down at his notes, a reflexive movement betraying his disorientation. The script he had prepared, the narrative he had believed himself writing, it no longer held the weight it did mere minutes ago. And Leo, ever still, ever rooted, watched him with the patient sadness of a man who had seen this play out in many rooms, on many faces, for many years. But Leo did not gloat. Instead, he leaned in, not physically, but spiritually, and began to speak with the cadence of a shepherd addressing not an opponent, but a sheep too wounded to realize it had strayed. The error, he said, is not in your passion. The error is in your premise. Jasper looked up, caught off guard by the absence of offense. He was being corrected, not attacked. You confuse engagement with endorsement, Leo continued. You believe that to speak to the world, we must sound like it. That to walk with the wounded, we must abandon the map. He turned slightly now, addressing not just the man before him but the audience beyond the lens, beyond the continent, beyond even the church. But the church does not echo the world. She echoes eternity. He let that sit, not as a claim, but as a rebuke too sacred to shout. We are not activists, he said. We are shepherds. The activist changes laws. The shepherd guards souls. And sometimes the soul must be defended against what the world insists is progress. It was not arrogance that filled the room, it was order. The kind of order that realigns rather than dominates. Then, without warning, Leo turned the lens inward, straight back at Jasper, not to strike, but to pierce. Tell me, he said, why does holiness disturb you? The question came not with accusation, but with unbearable clarity. Is it the silence of it? The surrender? The refusal to flatter your instincts? Or perhaps, he said, voice now quieter, it's because holiness does not explain itself. It convicts. Jasper did not reply. Not out of protest. Not out of principle. But because he couldn't. The question had not sought an answer. It had exposed the absence of one. And for the first time since the broadcast began, Jasper's confidence was not merely shaken, it was revealed to have been posture all along. Leo did not smile. He did not nod in triumph. He simply sat back, the rosary now hidden once more beneath his robes, as though he had never lifted it at all. And the room, worlds away from the moment it had been 20 minutes earlier, no longer belonged to a journalist or even a pope. It belonged to truth. You just witnessed truth win without shouting. If that moved you, subscribe to Circle of God's Glory. If not, comment below, but at least face what unsettled you. Don't scroll away and call it indifference. That's not neutrality. That's fear in costume. The tension had broken, not with fanfare, not with triumph, but with the hush that follows a soul encountering something too deep for language. Jasper sat quiet now, his face a mask of control concealing the storm within. The confrontation was over, not because one man had defeated another, but because one truth had refused to bend. And yet, Pope Leo did not remain in that posture of correction. He did not linger in victory. Instead, his entire presence shifted. Still dignified, but softened, as if he had set aside the sword and picked up the shepherd's staff. He looked beyond Jasper, beyond the cameras, into a space only the spirit could perceive. This, he said, his voice gentler now, was never about who is right. It is about what is right. The words, so simple on their surface, sank like stones into the collective chest of the audience, because truth rarely demands volume. It demands presence. This is not a debate. This is not about left or right, tradition or trend. This is about the soul. Yours. Mine. The soul of the church. The soul of the world. He spoke now as a pastor, not a pontiff, as a man who had buried mothers, who had wept with prisoners, who had washed the feet of enemies. I know what it feels like to be lost in the noise. To doubt your place in the world. To wonder if God still hears your name in a culture that forgets it the moment you log off. The quiet deepened. Some among the audience had bowed their heads. Others stared forward, unblinking, as if afraid that blinking would break whatever spell had settled over the space. I speak to the one who prays and hears nothing, Leo continued. To the one who left the church because of betrayal, or boredom, or because no one noticed they were gone. I speak to the one who doubts, the one who rages, the one who wants to believe again but doesn't know how. He paused. Not for effect, but for truth to catch up with breath. There is still a place for you. But not a place of comfort. A place of courage. Not a place of flattery. A place of fire. His hands remained folded, his voice calm, but now the cadence of a homily began to form. We need a church that does not chase trends but chases souls. That does not entertain, but intercedes. That does not perform, but prays. That does not whisper apologies for its holiness but offers it boldly, like bread broken in famine. Then came the question. Quiet, devastating, and meant for every conscience watching. What kind of church are we passing on? It hung there, accusation and invitation, lament and hope, all at once. He said no more. Because nothing more needed to be said. Don't just watch. Respond. Subscribe to Circle of God's Glory if you want to be part of something deeper. If not, don't leave without telling us why. Let your conscience speak. And let the world see whether you bowed to conviction, or blinked. What would you have said, if you were in that room? Not behind a screen. Not buffered by anonymity or opinion polls. But seated there, between the weight of centuries and the hunger of modernity, in the very moment when a man in white chose silence over spectacle, and truth over applause. Would you have spoken up? Would you have nodded? Would you have shifted uncomfortably in your seat, unsure if what you felt was inspiration, or indictment? The question is no longer for the journalist. It's not for the theologians, the bishops, or even the critics who will write their columns tonight. The question is for you. Because truth, once spoken, does not simply echo. It asks. And it asks not for approval, but for response. This conversation was never about defending a throne. It was about discerning a pulse, yours. So now, as the cameras dim and the echo of words fades into memory, you are left with the one thing no one can steal from you, choice. Not a choice between popes, policies, or platforms. But a choice between remaining as you are, or becoming who you were always meant to be. We don't need louder mouths. We need deeper hearts. If you watched this and something shifted inside you, even a little, subscribe to Circle of God's Glory. Not to follow us, but to follow the ache for something higher, older, and holier than this age dares to remember. And if you won't subscribe, then say so. Tell us in the comments. But don't walk away from truth like it's a YouTube ad. Don't scroll past the mirror and pretend you didn't see yourself. May we all seek truth with humble hearts. Amen.